From the early period of medieval times, all kinds of medieval weapons were being developed as wealthy landowners and kings sought to increase their wealth and power by invading other people's territory, hoping to steal their land and treasures, such as gold, silver and other precious metals. There were many different types of medieval weapons used throughout the medieval period. The most common and well-known weapon, amongst the warriors of the Middle Ages, was swords. A sword is a bladed weapon, with a double-edged straight blade, more than 60 centimeters long, intended for slashing or thrusting. Swords of the noblemen were especially richly decorated, and were also often attributed with supernatural powers. Though swords of other warriors were slightly more modest, they display nevertheless an advanced craftsmanship. By a single stroke they could pierce through metal, but also inflict a deadly wound to the enemy. Apart from swords, another important weapon was sabres. The sabre, or sabre, is a type of cold weapons with a single-edged curved blade. This weapon originates from the east, from the equestrian tribes of Middle Asia. They were later adopted by the Persians, as well as nations of India and Japan. They were brought to Europe during the migration, and were used by the Huns, Avars and Hungarians. However, with the gradual dominance of sword as a primary medieval weapon, sabre vanishes from general use. It will re-emerge in Europe during the Turkish invasion of this area. Later, many nations that were in contact with the Turks will re-adopt the sabre, that is, the Polish will make it their national weapon. Karabela. Its widespread use is also witnessed by the Hussar army that was assembled of defectors who were skilled in Turkish type of warfare, by the Hungarian king Matyas Corvinus in 1474. This light cavalry's primary weapon was sabre. Knives were shorter type of weapon, consisting of a handle and a single blade. Since they were cheaper to make, they were most commonly used by peasants. Nowadays it is hard to differentiate which of them were used as a weapon, or in hunting and everyday household activities. Somewhat larger than knives were daggers. They were used for quick self-defense, by inflicting stab wounds, and also for putting the wounded out of misery. They were sometimes used in parallel with a sword, in a way that a warrior would hold a sword in one hand, and a dagger in the other. Due to its size, it could have easily been hidden in garments or various objects, which made it a very dangerous weapon. Even though they vanished from use in the early Middle Ages, they reappeared throughout the entire Europe during the 12th and 13th century. They became useful once more due to the evolution of heavy knights' armors, which were tough to pierce with a sword or some larger weapon. Thin dagger blades were ideal for this purpose, thus the knights used them increasingly, holding the sword in one hand, and the dagger in the other. Both footmen and horsemen used spears, a weapon that consisted of a long pole, on top of which was a blade with 2, 3, or 4 edges. Spears had been used since prehistory, with no major changes in design. During the Middle Ages, spears were used by all European nations, especially Germanic and Norman tribes. Imposing, but rarely used medieval weapons were battle axes. They had been used since prehistory, and they consisted of a handle and a blade which was shaped either as a parallelogram, a crescent moon, or a fan. In medieval Europe, they were mostly used by the Franks and the Vikings. However, it should be mentioned that, even though legends often display axes as a most common weapon used by Vikings, this was in fact a much more modest weapon. They were mostly used by warriors who couldn't afford a sword. Most of the preserved battle axes, due to their modesty, cannot be distinguished from the ones that were used by lumberjacks. Axe was used by knights in late Middle Ages, and sometime later it will have been used, once again, by infantry. Similar to axes were halberds, which consisted of a long pole, on top of which there was a spear, an axe or a beak. Not until the 16th century they were used by footmen for fighting against armored knights. Halberds were first used by the Swiss soldiers' footmen fighting against armored cavalry in the battle at Morgarten in 1315. This weapon was multifunctional, since the spear was used for hitting or piercing the horseman, the axe was used for inflicting cut wounds, and the beak for unhorsing the horseman. It had a distinctive form in each country it was used in, thus we can distinguish German, Swiss, Italian and Czech halberd. At the beginning of the 15th century, halberd was pulled to the center of the military formation, and was completely replaced by spear in the next century. Nowadays it is used only by the Papal Guard in Vatican. Although having appeared in as early as prehistory, mace and morning star were characteristical medieval weapons. A mace consists of a short handle and a head split into flanges. Flanges were narrow and long in 14th and 15th century, thus having been named Gothic maces. Later, they became more round and triangular, and by the number of flanges, we can distinguish 6-flanged, 10-flanged, 12-flanged and so on. By shape it is similar to morning star, the difference being that the morning star had a full bronze or iron head covered in spikes or pyramidal bulges. For their decorativity, both mace and morning star became symbols of dignity and honor in the Middle Ages, worn by civilians, towns judges and noblemen, as well as military commanders. A ranged weapon is any projectile, or weapon that launches a projectile. In contrast, a weapon intended to be used in man-to-man combat is called a melee weapon. Early ranged weapons include weapons such as javelins, throwing axes, the bow and arrow, and medieval siege engines like catapults, ballistas and trebuchets. Ranged weapons were effective in combat in comparison to melee weapons, as they gave the wielder opportunity to launch multiple projectiles before an enemy armed with melee weapons or shorter-ranged missile weapon posed a threat to him. With the new era, new types of warfare are introduced. The knighthood ceases to exist, and hired warriors battle in the battlefield. Although cold weapons remained in use, they were gradually replaced by firearms, which were through the course of time further improved.